might be a little bit of a cliche. A lot of instructors talking about how, oh, I'm drowned by emails and I feel like I'm constantly being bombarded by emails. But what I want to talk about today is the fact that there is actually some truth to that. Um, as a professor or instructor, I get so many emails, whether they're from students, whether they're from other people I'm working with, whether they're from the college or the university, or even just junk email. And a lot of those are important, and a lot of them are also not. And so I know very personally the struggle of trying to sort through that email inbox and make sure I'm responding to everyone in a timely fashion. And yet, at the same time, I'm also familiar with the position of a student when you're trying to perhaps email your professor, you have a question about an assignment, and they're not replying back to you in a timely fashion at all, and it can feel really stressful. And so, what I want to talk about today is the fact that our modern world is in fact dominated by email, and so in order to effectively communicate with each other through this medium, you really have to be strategic and purposeful in order for your message to stand out and make sure that you get a response in a timely fashion. So what I want to do today is walk through a couple of examples of how you can make the best first impression, knowing that through email is often how these first impressions get made. In my time teaching public speaking, I have gotten a lot of bad emails, not necessarily that the person was intentionally trying to be unprofessional or ask a question in a poor fashion, but I've gotten all sorts of examples of emails where, they don't introduce themselves. Maybe they just don't have good spelling or grammar, or they just ask a question, or just in general are speaking in an unprofessional fashion. And when I get these types of messages, it absolutely changes the way that I'm going to view whatever question they're asking, or even influence, how critical it is or how important I feel about responding to that email in a timely fashion. And so the reason I'm showing you these examples is not to necessarily shame anyone or call anyone out. That's why all these examples that you're looking at here have been kind of blacked out with all the names. But I just want to introduce this idea that thinking about how to send a appropriate and professional email is an important life skill, which will serve you not just in college and university, but also in whatever career you end up having. So what I'm going to talk about in this video here is several different criteria or components that you should keep in mind in order to send an effective email to your instructors and professors and hopefully get an effective response. So according to Laura Portwood-Stacer, there are 10 main elements that you should try to include in order to have an effective email. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is just walk us through those 10 elements and then leave you with a few final tips and tricks at the very end. So these 10 elements, if you keep them in mind, will give you a good template to follow anytime you need to follow up with your instructors, ask a question, or otherwise send an email to a professor. So the first one, actually item number 0, is going to be some meta information. So you can use the subject line of your email to kind of give us some pre-information or a preview of what that email is going to contain. So that way when I'm scrolling through my email inbox, it kind of stands out. So I highly recommend you include the course code and the course number. So for us, SPCM 200, not a bad idea to just throw that in that subject line. So that way, when I'm looking through my inbox, I can immediately identify, here's all my emails that are coming from students, from this class, or from another class, one way or the other. The other thing to keep in mind in that meta information, try to use your institutional or university email address. That way I actually know who it is. It's less likely to get caught up in a spam filter. And also just in general, it looks a lot more professional if it's coming from that .edu email address rather than, the Gmail account you created in the 3rd grade. One thing to keep in mind is that if you use the Canvas messaging feature, which I know a lot of people do, it's a little convenient. Just know that if you were to do that, I can't actually see the subject line when it shows up in my email inbox. All I see is that so-and-so has sent me a message on Canvas, and it's a lot harder for me to actually just kind of skim through and know what it's about. So moving forward, element number 1, the salutation. From the very first word, it's a chance to establish a professional relationship. Probably don't want to just jump straight into the email message. Start with, hi, hello, dear Dr. So-and-so. Depending on the level of relationship that you have with this professor, so for instance, if it's a close advisor, you might be able to get away with, a hey, Dr. So-and-so, but in general, start more professional and then become more and more casual if it is appropriate. Element number 2, the honorific, and by that I mean just make sure that you are kind of paying or indicating some respect to your professor and their credentials. So by starting with, that doctor or professor before you even use their name, it's communicating respect for their title and position and already showing that you kind of understand this professional working relationship that you're having. So remember, even though you're not necessarily emailing like an actual medical doctor, most of your professors do actually have PhDs, which does mean that the correct title is doctor or professor. One note I will bring up is that especially if you're emailing a female professor, you don't want to use Miss, Mrs., or Miss instead of doctor, because a person's title is determined by their profession, their actual school credentials, and not necessarily their marital status. A lot of my female colleagues actually will be pretty offended or feel disrespected if you call them Miss or Mrs. when they actually are a doctor. That said, it does feel a little bit tricky, not necessarily always knowing what you should be calling your professors. The best thing to do, it might feel a little awkward, but you can ask them like, hey, what would you prefer me to address you as? But the main thing is to use whatever your instructor requests. So for me, I'm totally cool if you want to use just my first name, hi Ben, and I don't mind that, but I also know that many of my colleagues would be more, not necessarily offended, but they might not see that quite as professional. Moving on to element number 3, after you have the honorific, obviously you're going to need to have their name. Not too much here. The main thing, please get the name correct. I've had emails that are meant for me, but they don't have my name correct. And so if you don't even have the respect to take the time to, make sure you're using my name, all that really communicates is that you don't really care about the class, and I'm not going to feel as invested in spending the time to answer your questions. Also, make sure you spell their name correctly. This information is on the syllabus, on Canvas. And so again, if you just get my name wrong, it really is communicating that you're not taking the time to take the class or the email seriously. Remember, again, when in doubt, ask. If you're not sure what your professor or instructor would like to be addressed as, just ask them, and that's totally fine. Most of us don't mind answering that question. Number 4, before you even launch into whatever the email's about, it's kind of respectful to have some sort of a meaningless nicety, just some sort of a introduction to indicate that, yes, I recognize you as a human being. I'm not just trying to get information out of you. Think about this anytime that you actually see someone face to face. You kind of start with that small talk. It's not actually specific to whatever the conversation is about, but it is this ritual of polite communication, which we can emulate in an email setting as well. And so that might be as simple as, oh, I hope you had a good weekend. I hope this email is reaching you well. Or I enjoyed talking to you earlier today about this, or this, which can also start giving a little reminder about who you are and give us a preview of what this email is going to be about. I think this is really important, not because I really care about telling you about, here's what the weather is or anything like that. But again, it helps us recognize each other as human beings and actually have a positive working relationship and not just kind of feeling like, oh, we're here to trade information and nothing more beyond that. Moving on, element number 5, you want to include a brief note about how I, the professor reading the email, actually know you, the student who's writing the email. Keep in mind that your instructors are going to work with hundreds of different people, whether that's students, other faculty, or other people in the college. So it's important to have some sort of context and explanation of kind of who you are and how I know you. If it's someone that, if you're emailing a professor that you're currently in their class, probably less of an issue since I know who all of you are, but especially if you're, say, emailing someone you'd had in a previous semester or maybe a professor you've actually never worked with before, it helps to have some sort of information. So for instance, I'm a student currently taking your SPCM 201 class, or hi, I'm Ben and I spoke to you after class last week about this, or hi, I'm a current student and I'm interested in enrolling in your class next term. Just some sort of information about what the current relationship between you is, to kind of give some context to whatever you're going to ask next. Bringing us to element number 6, this is where you start getting into the actual reasons that you're sending this email. So you want to be clear, concise, and courteous about this. So don't write a full paragraph where I kind of have to decode what you're asking about. If you have a clear question, be pretty specific about, I'm writing to ask you a question about this, or I'm having a problem with this assignment, or I need to schedule a meeting with you about this. This is one of those cases where being really concise is helpful because it helps me get through that email faster and know more quickly what do I need to provide to you to be most helpful. One note I will offer, if you are asking to schedule a meeting, it does help to kind of offer a little preview of some of your own times of, I'm generally available these days at these times, just so that way we can kind of already start that scheduling process. Moving on to element number 7, this isn't quite in the email itself, but just something to keep in mind. Make sure to actually read the syllabus. I will say the majority of emailed questions that I get from students are already answered either in the syllabus or something that's written on Canvas. And so in the time that it takes for you to write me an email, wait for me to respond, and then actually read that response, it's often a lot quicker for you to just check your other resources beforehand to save your own time and hopefully get answers to your questions quicker. Again, also, it just kind of signals that you are taking the class seriously, you're taking the time and taking ownership of your own learning. And so in your email, you might even kind of allude to that by saying, oh, I noticed in the syllabus it says this, or this, and because of that, I have this additional question. Or, I already read the assignment description, but I would like clarification about this specific point. If you are at the point where you're asking your instructor a question via email, it helps to be as specific as possible, which again, not only saves my time, but really saves your time too and gets you the answers that you need more quickly. Finally, on a similar note, that brings us to element number 8. What are some of the things that you've already done? One of the worst emails that I can get is, the equivalent of like, well, I've tried nothing and I'm already out of ideas. Because we're all college students, we all are generally able to kind of do some problem solving on our own. So before you reach out to the professor and start asking questions, kind of give us a sense of what you've already done. What's the homework or kind of searching around you've already done. And that can even be as simple as saying, well, I checked with a couple of other students and they were saying this, but we still want further clarification. Or even just saying what you're currently thinking of doing. Because I'm unsure of what the style guide is, currently using APA style, but wanted to ask for clarification. Again, this just shows me as the instructor that you as the student are taking the class seriously and are taking the time to really think about what work you're doing. And when you include that information in the email, again, it shows me when I'm reading the email, okay, you as a student really care about this, you've put some time into this, and it also helps me give you a more specific answer that's going to be more directly targeted at what you're actually asking. And then once you've kind of asked your question or provided your information, we're kind of moving into the conclusion of the email. Element number 9 is the sign-off and the deliverables. So you want to make it clear, what does the person reading the email need to do, or is the response even required? So for instance, if you're emailing a professor to ask for a letter of recommendation, let us know what the next steps are. I'm going to need that in the next 2 weeks, this, or this. Or if you're just sending an email to, let me or your instructor know about something and you don't expect a response from me, you can even just add a quick line of, I'm sending you this information just as an FYI. And that way I know that I don't necessarily need to reply to you. Or if you are expecting a certain deliverable, I, as the instructor reading the email, have a sense, okay, here's what this person is directly looking for. And then finally, element number 10 is the signature of the email. This is pretty straightforward. Just have a simple closing line, either thank you, best regards, sincerely, just sort of something. It doesn't have to be as formal as, a written letter, but something to kind of wrap up the email and maintain that professional rapport. And then, of course, including your full name is beneficial. In our setting for this class, since there's so few of you, I generally know who everyone is, but especially if you're emailing a professor in one of those large 100-person lecture sections, having your full name can be really helpful, so that way if I do need to say, look up information in the Canvas gradebook, I have your last name to kind of look that up. Again, it's generally best to err on the side of being more professional and using your full name, and then you can kind of dial that back and be more casual the more you have that relationship with that professor. And so overall, these 10 elements, when put together, should give you a helpful email template to write any type of email to your professor, whether that's providing information, asking a question, or just reaching out to stay in touch. Again, it might feel like this is a little bit silly or, a lot of minor details here, but by maintaining this sort of professional type of communication in your emails, you can maintain not just a professional, but an effective working relationship with all your professors and instructors. And so next, just to wrap up, I just want to give us a couple of quick tips and tricks, things that I do whenever I'm sending an email. One, I think it helps to enter the email address last, so that way you can't actually accidentally send the email beforehand. this here, just hi, this is an actual email that I've gotten before, and then of course it was followed up, 5 minutes later by, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, that's sent early. So if you enter that email address after you write the entire email, you kind of avoid that problem. Two, always attach any files if you're sending them. Attach those first. Again, I've done this so many times too. I write this email, I send it off, here's these files for you, and then immediately after realize, shoot, I didn't even attach the files. So make sure to include those first. Of course, always double check the spelling and grammar. This just kind of helps make a difference. I'm usually able to decode any spelling errors, but when you take the time to check the spelling and grammar, correct capitalization, for instance, again, that just shows that you are taking the time to take this seriously. And then finally, this is less important now that we're doing asynchronous online classes, but if you are currently in the classroom in my face-to-face class, don't email me during the class. I can see this timestamp, and when I see that you wrote this email during class, all that signals to me is that you weren't actually paying attention to me during the fact. And so hopefully these 10 email components and these little tips and tricks are helpful to you to give you a sense of how to write an effective professional email. There's a good chance when you were in elementary school you may have been taught how to write a friendly letter, a formal letter, or a business letter, and now I'm hoping that you can also add how to write a professional email to that toolkit as well. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions, comments, concerns, and potentially even using some of these tips and tricks when you reach out to me.